Hello, I'm Paul Bradshaw. I'm the founder of HelpMeInvestigate.com, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and do a short video about the background to Help Me Investigate, a bit about what we've learned from Help Me Investigate and what we've done with Help Me Investigate, and I may split those into a number of videos. We're already a minute into this one. I'm going to hold this, I'm recording this on a laptop, which I'm going to kind of move around like that just to make it slightly less boring. So Help Me Investigate. What's the story behind it? What is it? Well, Help Me Investigate is, in a line, a platform for crowdsourcing investigative journalism. Put in less techie language, what that means is that it's a website where people can collaborate to investigate stories and questions that are in the public interest. The site was launched on July the 1st last year, 2009, but the process leading up to that really started probably in about September 2007. There was a competition, the Night News Challenge in America, which you may have heard of, and I think it was in its second year that year in 2007, and they were inviting people, not just in America but all over the world, to submit ideas for online projects that they would fund. And I put in an idea called 5 W's and a H. I think it was called the Conversation Toolkit. And that was the main idea that I put in. But as a kind of an afterthought, I put in a second proposal for something which I then called Citizen Investigation. This idea came from some research that I had been doing into investigative journalism on the internet and the forms that it was taking online. And there were two key stories that really influenced my thinking here. The first was an investigation by the Florida News Press into water connection charges. So charges being made to new houses to connect to the water supplies, which were suspiciously high, basically. And the Florida News Press didn't have the resources to pursue this story, so they basically invited their readers to help. And this is quite a well-known anecdote now, a well-known example of crowdsourcing. What happened was that readers collaborated. They had engineers looking at blueprints, they had accountants looking at spreadsheets, they had inside whistleblowers, all kinds of people came forward to help with the story. Now that's really interesting in and of itself, but actually that was incidental to me. What was particularly interesting in this story was that story, the story about the water connection charges, became the Florida News Press's most successful story, most popular story on their website ever, apart from hurricanes. And this was a story about water connection charges. This is quite a dry subject. You know, if you were writing this in print, how many people would actually read this? Would it really be that big a story? You know, you might put it on the front cover, but how many people would read it? And what that said to me was that there was a tremendous potential here for engagement around crowdsourcing. It wasn't necessarily just about the story itself, but the fact that by involving users, people, in the process of gathering that story and digging into it, you actually produced much more engagement. People were more interested in that story, and there was a social element to it. And that was really interesting to me, and I wanted to see how we might replicate that. The second story, which really informed my thinking behind what was then called Citizen Investigation, was the contaminated pet food story in America. And this was the story where a number of pets were starting to fall ill and some of them die, and pet owners were trying to find out what was happening, and basically it turned out that there were shipments of pet food that were contaminated coming from China. Now, the mainstream media didn't really cover this story very much at all. They didn't see it as particularly important, and you can understand why. As a journalist, you look at this story and say, well, it's pets, you know, it might not be particularly important in the news agenda. But for pet owners, this was a really important story, you know, this was really quite personal to them. And the pet owners self-organised, they used the internet to collaborate, to dig into this story, to find out about the information. And ultimately, some of the websites involved got banned in China, and they compiled a database of thousands of pets, which completely contradicted the American FDA story of things, where they only had recorded a handful of pets being affected. So that was really interesting to me, and that was interesting to me for a different reason, and that was about the news agenda. You know, we talk about investigative journalism, but we have to recognise that investigative journalism has fashions, it has phases, and journalism generally has a news agenda that it follows. And there are certain types of stories and issues which are not going to get investigated, or are less likely to get investigated at particular times. So, for example, in the 1980s, miscarriages of justice stories were very popular. Now they're out of fashion, and you could go over all kinds of different types of stories. So the idea of readers being able to set an agenda and decide what got covered, for me, was another really interesting dynamic of the web. And again, I wanted to look at the potential of that for online journalism. So citizen investigation came out of those in particular, and other kind of research and experiences that I'd had in online journalism. And I put in this very sketchy idea to the Night News Foundation, and to my surprise, that idea and the other one both reached the final shortlist. And that kind of made me think, well, there must be something in this idea, and that motivated me to develop it further. And so the first thing I did was change its name, and changed all kinds of other things about it. There was it was probably a much simpler idea, that it was more about one particular question being investigated rather than number. But anyway, so fast forward to September 2008. I put in a revised proposal to the Knight Foundation, but I also put in a bid to the 4IP fund in the UK. And this is a fund that was run by Channel 4 and in the Midlands, an organisation called Screen West Midlands, which is a regional development agency. So they're about stimulating economic growth in the Midlands. And this idea, Help Me Investigate, was one of the first projects to be funded. 4IP is still running, by the way. Now, they kind of, I think we put in the idea around September. They probably said yes about October, but it took another 4 or 5 months, basically until the end of March 2009, before we actually signed contracts, because as you can imagine with an idea like this, there are all kinds of legal issues to address. So I'm going to leave the story there, because we're coming up to 10 minutes, and that's the limit on YouTube. And in the next video, I'll talk a bit about, once we had the funding from Channel 4, what we did in building Help Me Investigate.